Hi, everybody. It is so good to see everybody and welcome back. And if this is your first time joining us good, I'm live now. So hi, everyone. And for those of you who've joined us before for our story time, welcome back. And for those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. So my name is Rachel, and I work at the museum at Eldridge Street. And just a little bit about our museum. So our museum is actually inside this very old and very beautiful synagogue that was built a very long time ago in 1887, and it was built by immigrants who came from Eastern Europe in the late 1800s, and they built our beautiful synagogue. And it still stands today. I actually brought with me a picture of our synagogue. You can see what it looks like. And something else to notice is kind of interesting. In the background, you can even see that there's this really tall, very modern looking apartment building. You can kind of tell our building looks very old compared to some of the other buildings around it. And that's something we're going to talk a lot about today for our story time. Because one of the things that I love to do at our museum is tell students and families all about how communities change over time. And that's a big part of our story. The museum at Eldridge Street is in a neighborhood called the Lower East Side, which is in New York City. And New York City, as we know it today, with its skyscrapers and subways and bridges, it didn't always look that way. And so cities grow and they change, and those changes don't happen overnight. It takes a lot of time. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to read a very special story all about how communities change, called The Little House. And then we're going to get a chance to do an art project where we get to make our own little houses. And I'm going to show you how to do that. But before we get started, I think it's just important just to go over a couple of really important words. We talk a lot about the word community, and that's maybe a word we know a lot about. Your community is where you live, it's where you work, it's maybe where you go to school or hang out with your friends. So they're all different types of communities. And I wanted just to go over a couple of different types because they're gonna be very important to the story we read today. So if you look outside your window, or maybe you took a walk today, maybe if you live in a place with a lot of really tall buildings and there's a lot of people, like New York City, where I work is a really good example. So a word we would use to describe that kind of community is this. You can say it with me. This is urban. So urban is like a city. So if you live in a city, you say you live in an urban community. And then maybe you live in a community where there's like lots of houses that are further spread apart and smaller buildings. Or that's a community that maybe is on the edge or around a city. Maybe you guys know the word already if you're studying it. Suburban. So, or the suburbs is another word. And then finally, if you live in a community where there maybe aren't a lot of people, or maybe you live near farms and lots of land, and we would call that rural. So these are three different types of communities, and I want us all to remember these three words because they're going to be very important to our story. And so I'm very excited to introduce this book with you today. So this book is called The Little House, and it's by Virginia Lee Burton. And I just want to point out here that it has a special award called the Caldecott Award. So it won a special award for the artwork. And I love this book especially because one of the programs we do at our museum is we'll often go into schools and read this book to students and talk about the different types of communities. And then they come to the museum in Eldridge Street and they can see a real life example of how things change over time. So this book's very special to me. And I also, before we get started, I just want to give a special shout out to one of my favorite schools, Columbia Grammar and Preparatory School, and to Miss Lau and to all the second graders. Even though I can't be with you at the school at this time, I'm so glad you guys are going to be watching this video and hearing the story. So without further ado, The Little House by Virginia Lee Burton. Once upon a time, there was a little house way out in the country. She was a pretty little house, and she was strong and well built. The man who built her so well said, "This little house shall never be sold for gold or silver, and she will live to see our great-great-grandchildren's great-great-grandchildren living in her." There she is, the little house. The little house was very happy as she sat on the hill and watched the countryside around her. She watched the sunrise in the morning, and she watched the sunset in the evening. Day followed day, each one a little different from the one before, but the little house stayed just the same. You can see the sun is moving across the sky. In the nights, she watched the moon grow from a thin new moon to a full moon, then back again to a thin old moon. And when there was no moon, she watched the stars. Way off in the distance, she could see the light of the city. The little house was curious about the city and wondered what it would be like to live there. You can see it at night. Time passed quickly for the little house as she watched the countryside slowly change with the seasons. In the spring, when the days grew longer and the sun warmer, she waited for the first robin to return from the south. She watched the grass turn green and watched the buds on the trees swell and the apple trees burst into blossom. She watched the children playing in the brook. You can see the brook there. In the long summer days, she sat in the sun and watched the trees cover themselves with leaves and the white daisies cover the hill. She watched the garden grow, and she watched the apples turn red and ripen. She watched the children swimming in the pool. In the fall, when the days grew shorter and the nights colder, she watched the first frost, and then the leaves turned bright yellow and orange and red. She watched the harvest gathered and the apples picked. She watched the children going back to school. In the winter, when the nights were long and the days short, and the countryside covered with snow, she watched the children coasting and skating. Year followed year. The apple trees grew old and new ones were planted. The children grew up and went away to the city. And now at night, the lights of the city seem brighter and closer. One day, the little house was surprised to see a horseless carriage coming down the winding country road. Pretty soon, there were more of them on the road and fewer carriages pulled by horses. Pretty soon, along came surveyors and surveyed a line in front of the little house. Pretty soon, along came a steam shovel and dug a road through the hill covered with daisies. Then some trucks came and dumped big stones on the road. Then some trucks with little stones. Then some trucks with tar and sand. And finally, a steamroller came and rolled it all smooth, and the road was done. You can see what they mean when they say horseless carriage. Now the little house watched the trucks and automobiles going back and forth to the city. Gasoline stations, roadside stands, and small houses followed the new road. Everyone and everything moved much faster now than before. We're thinking of those words, remember? It's looking a bit more suburban now. More roads were made, and the countryside was divided into lots. More houses and bigger houses, apartment houses and tenement houses, schools, stores, and garages spread over the land and crowded around the little house. No one wanted to live in her and take care of her anymore. She couldn't be sold for gold or silver, so she just sat there and watched. It's a really big change now. Now it was not so quiet and peaceful at night. Now the lights of the city were bright and very close, and the streetlights shone all night. This must be living in the city, thought the little house, and she didn't know whether she liked it or not. She missed the fields of daisies and the apple trees dancing in the moonlight. Pretty soon there were trolley cars going back and forth in front of the little house. They went back and forth all day and part of the night. Everyone seemed to be very busy, and everyone seemed to be in a hurry. You can see the trolleys. Pretty soon, there was an elevated train going back and forth above the little house. The air was filled with dust and smoke, and the noise was so loud that it shook the little house. Now she couldn't tell when spring came, or summer, or fall, or winter. It all seemed about the same. We're looking now, we can say that we've gone from completely rural to an urban community here. Pretty soon, there was a subway going back and forth underneath the little house. She couldn't see it, but she could feel and hear it. People were moving faster and faster. No one noticed the little house anymore. They hurried by without a glance. Pretty soon, they tore down the apartment houses and tenement houses around the little house and started digging big cellars, one on each side. The steam shovels dug down 3 stories on one side and 4 stories on the other. Pretty soon, they started building up. They built up 25 stories on one side and 35 stories on the other. We maybe know what types of buildings these are that are really tall, so we're seeing skyscrapers. Now the little house only saw the sun at noon and didn't see the moon or stars at night at all because the lights of the city were too bright. She didn't like living in the city. At night she used to dream of the country and the field of daisies and the apple trees dancing in the moonlight. The little house was very sad and lonely. Her paint was cracked and dirty. Her windows were broken and her shutters hung crookedly. She looked shabby, although she was just as good a house as ever. She is. Then, one fine morning in spring, along came the great-great-granddaughter of the man who built the little house so well. She saw the shabby little house, but she didn't hurry by. There was something about the little house that made her stop and look again. She said to her husband, "That little house looks just like the little house my grandmother lived in when she was a little girl. Only that little house was way out in the country, on a hill covered with daisies and apple trees growing around." You can see. They found out it was the very same house, So they went to the movers to see if the little house could be moved. The movers looked the little house all over and said, "Sure, this house is as good as ever. She's built so well we could move her anywhere." So they jacked up the little house and put her on wheels. Traffic was held up for hours as they slowly moved her out of the city. You can see there she goes. At first, the little house was frightened, but after she got used to it, she rather liked it. They rolled along the big roads until they were way out in the country. When the little house saw the green grass and heard the birds singing, she didn't feel sad anymore. They went along and along, but they couldn't seem to find just the right place. They tried the little house here and they tried her there. Finally, they saw a little hill in the middle of a field and apple trees growing around. "There," said the great-great-granddaughter, "that's just the place." "Yes, it is," said the little house to herself. A cellar was dug on top of the hill, and they slowly moved the house from the road to the hill. The windows and shutters were fixed, and once again they painted her a lovely shade of pink. As the little house settled down on her new foundation, she smiled happily. Once again, she could watch the sun and moon and stars. Once again, she could watch spring and summer and fall and winter come. Once again, she was lived in and taken care of. Never again would she be curious about the city. Never again would she want to live there. The stars twinkled above her. A new moon was coming up. It was spring, and all was quiet and peaceful in the country. And so this is one of my favorite books to read with students. And something I wanted to show you also today is that even though the little house in the story is a work of fiction, there are, in fact, real-life examples of little houses everywhere. And I brought some pictures with me today to show you. And this maybe is something you want to do next time you go on a walk in your neighborhood. Really look at the buildings, see what you notice. And here's one, for example. So this is a building here on the Upper East Side in the East 50s. And you can see that it's much smaller and shorter than the two buildings next to it. So always a little clue. If you're looking at a lot of buildings, one of the things you can do to kind of tell which one are the older buildings is see how small or short they are compared to the other buildings next to them. So we can tell this was built first, and then these two buildings came later. And another one of my favorites, since I work in the Lower East Side, is this one. So this was a house that was built in the 1830s, and it's on Allen Street, which is just around the corner from us. And it's still standing today. So if next time you're in the neighborhood and you take a walk, you can go and see this building. It's still standing. And another thing, so students sometimes ask, can you really move a building like what they did in the story? And the answer is you can do that. So another example from right here in New York City, this is a really wonderful example. If anyone here is an Alexander Hamilton fan, this is a picture of Hamilton House, or it's known as the Grange. And the Hamilton House, he had it built up in Harlem, what's known as Hamilton Heights. And then this is a museum today, you can go and visit this house. And in 2006, they actually moved it to be close in the park. So you can see what they did. They jacked up the house, just like we saw in the book, and they moved it a couple of blocks to the location where it is now. So you can sometimes actually do this with an old building like this. Now, coming back to our building for a moment, Do you think we could move this building? Probably not. This is way too heavy and way too old to do that. So, and a little bit of a different story, but in some ways the same. Just like the little house, our building has been around for over 130 years. And while it's still here today, a lot of things around the building have changed with the new buildings coming up, or maybe new immigrant communities moving into our neighborhood. And it got to a point, just like in the little house, where people really weren't able to care for the building anymore. And they had to close this whole top part down. If you come visit the museum or go on our website, you can learn more about this part of the story. But I brought with me a picture. This is the inside. This is an area part of the building called the main sanctuary. And many, many years ago, a group of people came inside, and this is what they found. You can see all the windows are broken and the ceilings are dirty. And it was in very, very bad condition, just like what happened to the little house. And thankfully, there were people that cared about this building, and they put a lot of time and work and a lot of love into restoring the synagogue and making it beautiful again. So a lot of repainting and fixing. And today, this is what it looks like. So you can see the then and now. And so for us at the museum, we really connect to the story of the little house. And I do hope that now that you've read the story with me, that maybe you'll be inspired to go out into your neighborhood and to find the little houses and where you live and learn their stories. And later on, we are going to have on our website a really cool activity you can do where you can do some of this like exploration of your neighborhood. But what we're going to do today is a special art project where you can also create your own little house or apartment building. So I have with me, I made the little house. How do you think I did? But as you can see, I used a couple of different materials. This is a paper bag and crayons and construction paper. So what I really love about this activity is you can use a lot of different things to make it. It does not have to look like mine. But what I would recommend, if you have a paper bag like this, you can start with that. And what I did for my little house to make it look like a house, I cut it just to make it look a little shorter. But I'll show you another one I was working on. I was feeling very inspired because I live in an apartment building. You could also do an apartment building. So the first thing you'll want to do is find a paper bag. It does not have to be a lunch, like the classic lunch bag. And if you have things around the house, like a shoebox, for example, those can also work just as well. And then the next thing you want to do is decorate your building first. So I used crayons, but if you have markers or paints, you can do that as well. I do live actually in a really old, like tenement style apartment building. So I love the brick, so I did that. So I did the sides and the back to give the full effect. And then the next thing you're going to want to do, of course, if we think about houses or apartment buildings, what are some things that houses and apartment buildings need? They need windows, they need doors. I created for the front of mine, we have a stoop, the steps going up into the entrance of your building. And for that, you can see here in my windows, I just used construction paper. And you can have maybe a grown-up help you do this. You can cut out squares and make your windows. And I wanted to fill them with different pictures. So some curtains, me and my family. And also just thinking about, because, you know, we're all home right now and there's all these brave people on the front line. We have signs in the windows of our building where people are thanking their frontline workers. So that was something that really inspired me. So you can glue or paste your windows and doors. And then the next thing you're going to want to do is, the goal is to have these standing up. So you don't want them just to be flat. So you open the bag up. So not only is it standing, it kind of gives this, 3D volume effect. And now what you're going to do is you're going to take some paper. It could be like some old newspaper or magazines. Maybe you had some old like printing paper with that you were going to throw away. So any of that works. And you're just going to crumble it up. And it's going to help your building just stay open. So it's not going to fall flat and it'll stay upright. And then the last part, creating your roof. So I'm always really inspired by in the Lower East Side. If you look up at a lot of the old tenement apartment buildings, one of the things you might learn is they have the names of the architects and also sometimes the dates when the buildings were built. So I was really inspired by that when I did this. And so you're going to cut out a rectangle, and that's going to be your roof. And you're going to place it on the top. And then you can grab some tape or a stapler. And there you have it. So my little apartment building or your very own little house. So that is the end of our story time, but I really enjoyed reading with you. And I hope you'll do this activity. You can send us pictures of the little houses or buildings that you make. You can tag us. We are on social media. Our Instagram is @Museum at Eldridge Street. And check out our website and our Facebook page. We're going to have an activity coming out soon where you can actually go look through old photos of places in your neighborhood and learn more about their history. So that's it for today, but it was so nice reading the story with all of you. I look forward to seeing you again for another story time and activity, and I can't wait to welcome all of you to the museum when we reopen. Take care and have a great day.